Ethan Carter, a wealthy and arrogant tech millionaire, agreed to a bet that would change his life in ways he never imagined. The challenge: to marry an overweight woman who was completely out of place in his world. But then, the most unexpected thing happened. For Ethan Carter, life was a carefully orchestrated performance. He was always the star of the show, the charming tech millionaire with the perfect smile, fast cars, and a string of adoring models. To him, everything was a game, and he had long since mastered the art of winning. That evening in Manhattan began like so many others. The exclusive cocktail party was filled with champagne glasses, smiling faces, and light conversations about takeovers and deals. Ethan leaned against the marble bar, a glass of whiskey in his hand, when Marcus Blake, his childhood friend and longtime rival, approached him. "I'll give you this, Ethan," Marcus said with a sly grin. "You know how to win, in business, in life. But have you ever won anything that actually cost you something?" Ethan raised an eyebrow. "Everything has a cost, Marcus. Some people can just afford it." Marcus chuckled, a mocking tone underlying his laugh. "You don't get it, do you? You only play games you know you can win. But what if I challenged you to something you couldn't buy?" Ethan took a sip of his whiskey, his grin brimming with confidence. "Try me." Marcus leaned in closer, lowering his voice to a whisper. "I bet you don't have the guts to marry someone who doesn't fit your perfect image. No models, no heiresses, someone I choose. And you have to stay married for 6 months, no exceptions." Ethan laughed dismissively. "And what do I get if I win? A round of applause from you?" 50,000, Marcus said, swirling his glass casually. "And of course, undeniable glory." Ethan hesitated, but his ego refused to back down. "Deal," he said at last, the word rolling off his tongue as if it were nothing. What was the worst that could happen? He had always managed to control every situation he encountered. This wouldn't be any different. 3 days later, Ethan sat in an exclusive restaurant, the kind where the waitstaff knew your name before you said it, and the wine list was longer than a novella. The table was perfectly positioned with a view of New York's glittering skyline. He waited with the calm assurance that had become his trademark. Then the door opened and his world shifted ever so slightly. Olivia Hughes walked in, exuding a confidence that filled the room. She was unlike anyone he had ever met. No tight designer dress, no exaggerated smile. She was fuller-figured, wearing a simple but elegant dress, and her eyes held a sharpness he couldn't quite place. "You must be Ethan Carter," she said without preamble, shaking his hand firmly. Her voice was warm, but carried an undercurrent of challenge. "That's right," Ethan replied, his self-assured tone intact. "And you must be Olivia." She smiled briefly, without a hint of flattery. "That's right. Let's not waste time. I know why I'm here." Ethan felt momentarily off balance. No one spoke to him like this. She sat down, sliding her chair back as if she owned the luxurious setting. During dinner, Ethan quickly realized that Olivia wasn't just physically different from the women he was used to, she was mentally different too. She wasn't intimidated by his status or charm. In fact, she seemed to challenge him in ways he couldn't predict. "I hear you made a bet," Olivia said suddenly, setting her wineglass down. Ethan smiled nervously. "Something like that, but it's nothing personal." "Oh, but it is personal," Olivia said sharply. "I'm not a pawn in your game, Ethan. If you think I'm here to please you or stroke your ego, you're mistaken." For the first time in years, Ethan didn't know what to say. Her honesty was disarming. It felt like she was peeling back his facade with just a few words. "And yet, here you are," he said finally, regaining his composure. "So tell me, why did you agree?" Olivia leaned back, her glass in hand. "Because I believe people can change, even someone like you." The silence that followed was heavier than Ethan had anticipated. When dinner ended and Olivia stood to leave, Ethan felt something he hadn't felt in years: a loss of control. "You play the game well," he said as he escorted her to the door. Olivia turned, her eyes sparkling with a mix of playfulness and challenge. "I'm not playing, Ethan. This is my life. You're the one who has to decide if you can keep up." As he watched her walk away, Ethan felt a strange mix of irritation and curiosity. This wasn't a woman he could manipulate or win over with his usual tricks. She was dangerous, and that made her irresistible. Later that night, Ethan stood by the window of his penthouse, gazing out at the city. He felt something unfamiliar stir within him. It wasn't arrogance nor confidence. It was uncertainty. Olivia had exposed something in him he didn't fully understand. She wasn't playing by his rules, and that made her more dangerous than anyone he'd ever met. The wedding was anything but traditional. No champagne, no guest list of hundreds, no lavish floral arches. It was nothing more than a business formality, a signature on a contract. Ethan Carter had barely paid attention to the ceremony. He was used to closing deals, not reciting vows. Olivia arrived in a simple cream-colored dress, no glitter, no fanfare. It suited her perfectly, understated yet undeniably present. Ethan watched her enter and felt a twinge of irritation. She seemed entirely unfazed by the fact that they were in one of Manhattan's most exclusive city halls. While he was acutely aware of every gaze on them, Olivia walked forward with calm determination, as if she belonged there. "I won't promise anything I can't deliver," Olivia said just before exchanging vows. Her tone was calm, but her eyes were sharp. Ethan felt his trademark grin falter. He had expected Olivia to feel uncomfortable, but instead, it was as if she had thrown him off balance. He muttered his own vows with mechanical precision, wondering why this woman made him feel so unnerved. When the ceremony ended and the official moment was behind him, Ethan felt a wave of relief. This was just one step in a game he knew he would win, or so he thought. That evening, they arrived at Ethan's penthouse, a gleaming palace of glass and steel overlooking the city. Olivia glanced around briefly but said nothing. No admiring glances, no flattery. She walked to the window, looked out at the skyline and said, "It's a beautiful view, but it's still just a room." Ethan frowned. Most people were immediately awed by his wealth, but Olivia seemed completely uninterested. He opened the door to one of the guest suites and gestured inside. It was a luxurious room with a walk-in closet, a canopy bed, and a bathroom larger than most apartments. "This is your room," he said. "I had some clothes picked out for you. Everything you need." Olivia glanced at the rows of designer dresses and luxury clothing, her face neutral. "That wasn't necessary," she said simply, "but thank you." Her tone was polite, but Ethan detected no gratitude. Once again, he felt that slight irritation. What would it take to rattle her even a little? Dinner was an exclusive affair, prepared by Ethan's personal chef. The table sparkled under crystal glasses and silverware. Olivia ate with the calm poise of someone who felt no need to impress. "What do you think?" Ethan asked, referring to the food. "It's delicious," Olivia said lightly, taking another bite. "But I hope you understand. I'm not here to be part of your decor." Ethan's fork froze mid-air. "Decor," he repeated, his tone a fraction sharper. Olivia set her wine glass down and met his gaze directly. "You're used to people admiring you, Ethan. They see your house, your money, your power as something to look up to. But that's not me. If you thought this was something I'd be impressed by, I'm afraid you'll be disappointed." Ethan felt his irritation rise. No one spoke to him like this. But instead of responding, he took a sip of wine and let her words sink in. This was new and uncomfortable. The days that followed didn't go much better. Olivia refused to adapt to his world. While Ethan relied on his chauffeur, Olivia walked the city streets. While his chef prepared elaborate meals, Olivia cooked simple dishes in the kitchen. Ethan couldn't understand why she resisted. "Why don't you use the amenities?" he asked one morning. "That's what they're there for." Olivia smiled faintly as she stirred a pot of oatmeal. "Because I don't want to rely on things I don't need. Maybe you should try that sometime." Ethan felt a sharp sting of irritation. Why did everything with her have to be a challenge? Why couldn't she just accept the ease of his world? Yet somewhere deep down, there was also a flicker of curiosity. How could someone who so clearly rejected his wealth and status remain so unshaken? On a Friday evening, Ethan hosted a dinner party with a few of his friends and business partners. It was an opportunity to introduce Olivia to his world. He had arranged for her to wear a designer dress, but Olivia had chosen her own simpler outfit. She sat at the table with a quiet elegance that stood in stark contrast to the loud conversation around her. Halfway through the evening, as Ethan boasted about his latest business deal, Olivia turned her gaze to him. "You have a talent, Ethan," she said, her tone calm but sharp. "You know how to bend everything to your will. But I wonder, do you know who you are without your deals and contracts?" The table fell silent. Ethan felt the blood rush to his face. He looked at Olivia, but her gaze remained steady. It wasn't an attack. It was a simple question, but one that completely unbalanced him. That night, on the car ride home, Ethan confronted her. "What were you thinking saying that back there?" he asked angrily. Olivia turned to him, her eyes resolute. "Telling the truth, Ethan. Maybe you should try it sometime." Later that night, as Ethan lay awake, Olivia's words replayed in his mind. She was different. She challenged him in ways he didn't understand. But worse, she was right. Who was he without his wealth? And why couldn't he answer that question? This wasn't just a bet anymore. This was a mirror, and Ethan wasn't sure he could face the reflection. It was a dreary Saturday morning when Olivia unexpectedly appeared in Ethan's home office. He was seated behind his sleek glass desk, absorbed in a multi-million-dollar deal, when she quietly opened the door. "I'm heading to the shelter," she said simply. She was dressed in jeans and a plain jacket, her hair tied back in a casual bun. The contrast with his tailored suit was almost comical. Ethan barely looked up. "All right, have fun," he mumbled, his eyes glued to the numbers on his screen. Olivia remained in the doorway. "I want you to come with me." Now he looked up, raising an eyebrow. "Come with you? Olivia, I have a company to run. I can't just waste my morning on—" He trailed off, unsure how to finish the sentence. "On what?" she asked sharply, her tone calm but with an underlying challenge. "On meeting people who have nothing? Maybe it'll give you some perspective." Ethan wanted to say no, to dismiss her request as unimportant. But there was something about her gaze, steadfast, almost mocking, that stopped him. It felt like she was daring him, like she wanted to see if he could admit that he knew nothing about her world. With a sigh, he stood. "Fine, one morning." The shelter was located in an old, run-down building on the outskirts of the city. The paint was peeling from the walls, and the air carried the heavy scent of old furniture and cleaning supplies. From the moment Ethan stepped inside, he felt out of place. This was not a space where he belonged. "This is Marla," Olivia said, introducing him to an older woman with grey hair and a warm smile. "She runs the center." Marla shook Ethan's hand with a firm grip. "Glad you're here," she said kindly. "We can always use extra hands." Ethan glanced at Olivia, but her expression was unreadable. "What do you need me to do?" he asked reluctantly. Marla handed him a clipboard. "We need volunteers in the common room. Just talk to the residents. Let them know they're seen." Ethan nodded slowly, though he felt utterly lost. He was used to closing deals, not making strangers feel valued. The common room was filled with worn-out couches and plastic tables. Ethan stood awkwardly in a corner as Olivia moved seamlessly among the residents. She laughed, greeted people by name, and listened intently to their stories. He didn't know how she did it. A man with a weathered face and a scar running down his right cheek sat alone at a table. Olivia approached him and nodded for Ethan to follow. "Ethan, this is Robert," she said. "Robert is a veteran. He has plenty of stories to share." Ethan extended his hand. Robert glanced at it before shaking it. "You're a businessman, right?" Robert asked without preamble. "That's right," Ethan replied, keenly aware of the gulf between their worlds. Robert leaned back, his gaze sharp. "People like you are the reason we end up in trouble. You take everything, and when there's nothing left, you leave us behind." Ethan swallowed hard. He wanted to say something, to come up with a counter-argument, but the words wouldn't come. He felt Olivia's hand briefly rest on his arm. "We're here to listen, Ethan," she said softly. After a few hours at the shelter, Ethan began to feel increasingly out of his depth. He had spoken with people who had lost everything: jobs, homes, families. As he listened to their stories, he felt an unfamiliar sense of shame. How many decisions had he made without considering the people they affected? When they were done, Ethan and Olivia sat together at a simple table with paper coffee cups in hand. Olivia looked at him, her gaze both gentle and resolute. "Why do you do this?" he asked finally. Olivia gave a faint smile. "Because it's necessary. Everyone deserves a second chance, Ethan. Even you." Her words hit harder than he expected. He looked at her, searching for a hint of mocking pity, but found only sincerity. For the first time in years, Ethan felt something he couldn't name, a sense that his world wasn't as complete as he thought. That evening, back in his penthouse, Ethan sat alone on the couch. He stared out at the New York skyline, at the glittering lights that once symbolized everything he had achieved. Now they felt hollow. He thought about Robert, about the stories he'd heard, and about Olivia, who walked her own path with such quiet confidence. Maybe Olivia's world wasn't as simple as he thought. Maybe his was. Ethan sat in his home office, surrounded by luxurious furniture and the soft glow of a designer lamp. His eyes rested on a stack of documents on his desk, but his thoughts were elsewhere. He thought about the shelter, about Robert's words, and about Olivia, who always seemed to know how to throw him off balance. He wanted to understand what made her so composed, why she constantly challenged him. His thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. Olivia stood in the doorway, her face tense, holding a stack of old papers tightly in her hands. "We need to talk," she said. Her voice was steady, but there was an undertone of emotion Ethan couldn't quite place. "Come in," he said, both curious and slightly wary. Olivia walked to his desk and placed the stack of papers in front of him. Ethan frowned as he looked at the yellowed documents. Letters, financial reports, and correspondence with company logos that seemed vaguely familiar. Then he saw the name Hughes & Co. "Do you recognize this?" Olivia asked, her voice low but piercing. Ethan stared at the name. It reminded him of a deal from years ago, a takeover that had barely registered with him. A small family business his company had swallowed up during a strategic expansion. "Yes," he said slowly. "Hughes & Curtis was one of our acquisitions. Standard business." "Standard?" Olivia repeated sharply. She leaned forward, her gaze filled with both anger and pain. "It wasn't standard business, Ethan. It was my family's company." Ethan felt his stomach tighten. He looked at the documents again, as though hoping they might tell him a different story. "My father built this company from nothing," Olivia continued, her voice trembling but determined. "He worked day and night to keep it alive. When your company came in, he asked for a partnership. He pleaded for a collaboration, but you said no. You wanted it all." Ethan swallowed hard, searching for words. "I didn't know," he began, but Olivia cut him off. "You didn't know because you didn't care," she said sharply. "To you, it was just another deal. To us, it was our future. When my father lost everything, he couldn't handle it. He took his own life." Her voice broke on those last words. Ethan felt a chill run down his spine. He wanted to say something, to do something, but he had no idea how to make this right. "Olivia," he started, but she shook her head. "I don't want your excuses," she said. "I want to know if you understand. If you've ever thought about what your decisions do to people." The room filled with a heavy silence. Ethan felt a deep shame he hadn't experienced in years. He thought back to all the deals, all the wins he'd achieved, without ever looking at the faces behind the numbers. "I don't know how to make this right," he said at last, his voice soft, "but I want to try." Olivia let out a short, humorless laugh. "Try? Do you think you can fix this with a donation or an apology? This isn't something you can buy, Ethan." Her words stung, but he knew she was right. Yet he felt a new determination rising within him, a need to do more than just apologize. That night, Ethan lay awake in his penthouse, staring at the ceiling as Olivia's words echoed in his mind. "I want to know if you understand." The truth was, he didn't understand. Not yet. But he wanted to. For the first time, he didn't just feel the need to prove himself, he felt the need to truly change. The next morning, Ethan got up early. He went to his office and pulled out the old files from Hughes & Co. He flipped through the reports and letters, and the more he read, the heavier his heart grew. This was more than just a failed acquisition. This was a family he had destroyed. Ethan picked up his phone and called his assistant. "I want you to assemble a team," he said. "We're going to figure out how to bring Hughes & Co.'s back to life, and I want the ownership returned to the original family." His assistant hesitated. "Are you serious, Mr. Carter? That could cost millions." Ethan thought of Olivia, of the pain and strength in her eyes. "Yes," he said, "I'm serious. He hung up and looked out at the city. For the first time, he felt like he was doing something not for himself, but for someone else. He knew it wouldn't be enough to restore Olivia's trust, but it was a start. Later that day, Olivia found him in his office, bent over the papers. She stood in the doorway, her expression unreadable. "What are you doing?" she asked finally. Ethan looked up, his eyes tired but resolute. "I'm trying to understand," he said, "and I want to make it right. It won't be easy, but I want to do something that actually matters." Olivia's face softened slightly. "That won't change what happened," she said. "What's lost is lost." "I know," he replied, "but maybe I can build something else, something that means more." She looked at him for a moment, and for the first time since their marriage, there was a flicker of respect in her gaze. But she said nothing more. She turned and walked away. Ethan watched her leave, determined to keep going. He knew the road ahead would be difficult, but for the first time he felt like he might be on the right path. Ethan Carter had never been one to dwell on his choices. Decisions were numbers, transactions were power, and emotions were a luxury he couldn't afford. But now, sitting in his home office with stacks of Hughes and Cupboard documents in front of him, he felt for the first time the weight of what he had done. This was no longer just a number on a balance sheet. This was Olivia's life, her family, her pain. He had asked his assistant to assemble a team to breathe new life into the company. The figures before him were far from encouraging. Bankrupt assets, unpaid debts, and a reputation tarnished by the takeover. But none of that mattered. This wasn't about business anymore. It was an attempt to restore something he had broken. His phone buzzed. It was a scheduled meeting with his board of directors. Ethan had postponed this conversation for as long as possible, but it was unavoidable. Taking a deep breath, he clicked to join the video call, his screen lighting up with the faces of his business partners. "Ethan," began one of the senior partners, a grey-haired man with a sharp gaze. "We've heard about your plans for Hughes & Co. You know this is a massive risk, don't you? It doesn't align with our strategic goals." Ethan kept his expression neutral. "This isn't about strategy," he said. "This is about responsibility." "Responsibility," repeated another partner with a cynical smirk. "That's a nice word, but it doesn't pay the bills. This will cost us millions, Ethan. Why would we try to save a bankrupt company?" "Maybe because it's our fault it went bankrupt," Ethan replied, his voice louder than he intended. "This company represents more than a failed deal. It stands for everything we've done wrong. If we don't try to fix this, what does that say about us?" The silence on the other end of the call was deafening. Finally, one of the partners shook his head. "This is naive, Ethan. If you move forward with this, you're on your own." Ethan felt a wave of frustration, but also a strange sense of relief. He had expected this, and for the first time, it didn't matter. "That's fine," he said. "I'm doing it anyway." That evening, Ethan stayed late in his office, lit only by the glow of his laptop and the soft sound of rain tapping against the window. He worked on a recovery plan for Hughes & Co., something he never would have considered in his earlier days. This wasn't for profit, not for status. It was for Olivia. He looked up when the door opened softly. Olivia stood there, her arms crossed, her gaze as sharp as ever. "What are you doing?" she asked. Ethan pushed some papers aside and gestured to the chair opposite him. "I'm working on a plan to revive Hughes & Co." Olivia remained standing, her eyes scanning the stack of documents on his desk. "Why?" she asked, her voice hard but tinged with emotion. "Do you think you can fix this? Do you think a recovery plan will undo what you've done?" Ethan sighed. "No," he said honestly. "I know it can't change the past, but I can't just sit here and do nothing. I have to try." Olivia stepped closer, her hands resting on the edge of his desk. "You still don't get it, do you? This isn't just about Hughes & Co. This is about all the people you've affected, all the lives you've changed without ever looking back." "I'm trying to understand," Ethan said, his voice softer now. "I know I've made mistakes, and I know this isn't enough. But it's a start." Olivia stared at him, her expression a mixture of anger and what looked like sorrow. "Ethan, you can't buy back the past, and I don't know if I'll ever believe you're doing this for the right reasons." She turned and walked away, her footsteps soft in the hallway. Ethan was left sitting there, feeling as though he had lost something he couldn't name. The next day, Ethan decided to take another step. He visited the old Hughes & Cohen factory, a crumbling building on the outskirts of the city. The walls were weathered, the windows broken, but there was still a sense of pride in the structure. This had once been the heart of Olivia's family. He could almost imagine her father hard at work, his dreams built into every brick. As he walked through the building, he encountered one of the former employees, an older man named Thomas. Thomas now worked in a small cafe nearby, but he recognized Ethan immediately. "You're Carter," Thomas said, his voice filled with bitterness. "You're the one who took everything." Ethan nodded slowly. "That's right," he said, "and I'm here to try to restore what I destroyed." Thomas let out a short, humorless laugh. "Restore? Do you think you can restore our lives? All you did was take and ruin." "I know," Ethan said, "but maybe I can give something back. Maybe I can make a difference, even if it's small." Thomas looked at him for a moment, as if trying to decide whether to take him seriously. Finally, he shrugged. "We'll see," he said. When Ethan came home that evening, he found Olivia on the balcony. She stood still, her arms wrapped around herself as she looked out at the city lights. He walked over but kept a respectful distance. "I went to the old factory today," he said quietly. "I spoke with one of the former employees. He doesn't believe I can make a difference, and honestly, I'm not sure I do either." Olivia turned to face him, her eyes tired but sharp. "Maybe you need to stop trying to prove something, Ethan. To them. To me. Maybe you need to figure out who you are without everything you've built." Ethan swallowed, her words heavier than he'd expected. He nodded slowly. "I'm working on it," he said, "every day." But Olivia said nothing more. She turned back toward the city, and Ethan stood beside her, the silence between them filled with everything that remained unsaid. The phone call came on a grey morning, just as Ethan was pouring his first cup of coffee. His assistant appeared in the doorway of his office, her face tense with worry. "Ethan, there's a journalist on the line. He says he has evidence of unethical practices in one of your old deals." Ethan's hand froze around the cup. A familiar chill of unease ran through him, the kind he would have ignored years ago with a quick, ruthless answer. But now he couldn't. He set the cup down and walked to his desk. "I'll take it," he said, picking up the phone. His voice was steady, but his heart pounded in his chest. The voice on the other end was sharp and businesslike. "Mr. Carter, we've received documents suggesting you were involved in market manipulation and deliberately excluded a partner from a takeover. Do you have a response?" Ethan's throat went dry. He knew the deal. It was a takeover from years ago, a decision that had made perfect sense at the time, but that now looked very different through the lens of who he had become. "Send me the documents," he said after a long pause. "I want to review them first." The journalist hesitated. "We're publishing tomorrow, Mr. Carter. This is your chance to share your side of the story." When the call ended, Ethan sat frozen in his chair. He knew this wasn't a storm he could simply weather. His past had caught up with him, and this time there would be no escaping it with half-truths. Later that day, Ethan sat in a crisis meeting with his legal team. The tension in the room was palpable, filled with nervous glances and the rustling of papers. "The documents are legitimate," said one of his attorneys, an older man with a piercing gaze. "But we can spin this. If we can test their accuracy, we can drag out the process. Eventually, we settle quietly and keep it out of the headlines." Ethan's jaw tightened. It sounded exactly like how he would have handled it in the past, burying problems with money and legal loopholes. But the idea alone made his stomach turn. "What if we tell the truth?" he asked. The room fell silent. The youngest lawyer at the table cleared his throat. "Mr. Carter, that would be a disaster. Your reputation, your company, it could all suffer irreparable damage." "Maybe it deserves to," Ethan said, his voice calm but firm. "I want to make a statement. No lies, no excuses, just the truth." His legal team erupted in protest, but Ethan wasn't listening. This time, he wanted to do things differently. Not for the media, not for his company, but for himself. That evening, Ethan found Olivia in the living room when he got home. She held her phone in her hand, her expression unreadable, a mix of anger, disappointment, and maybe even a hint of despair. "So," she began, her voice sharp, "your past has caught up with you." Ethan walked toward her slowly. He knew she was upset, that he had let her down again. But he had no excuses left. He stood in front of her, his voice low and honest. "Yes," he said, "and I'm going to make it right." Olivia let out a short, humorless laugh. "Make it right? How many times have you said that, Ethan? How many times do you need to be forced before you finally tell the truth?" "I'm trying," Ethan began, but she interrupted him. "Trying," she repeated, her voice trembling with emotion. "Ethan, you only change when you have no other choice. And even then it feels like you're doing it just to save yourself." Her words cut deep. He wanted to tell her it was different this time, that he was truly trying, but he knew words would never be enough. "I know it's hard to believe me," he said softly, "but I want to make this right. Not just for you, but because I owe it to everyone I've hurt." Olivia stared at him, her gaze probing, as though trying to decide if he meant it. Finally, she turned and walked away without another word. The next day, Ethan stood before a room full of journalists. The lights were bright, and he felt the cameras trained on him. He swallowed, his heart pounding in his chest, but he knew there was no turning back. "I'm here to take responsibility," he began, his voice steady. "In the past, I made decisions that hurt people. I was focused on my own success, and I didn't think about the consequences. That was wrong, and I won't try to justify it." He paused for a moment, scanning the room. "I know it will take time to rebuild trust, and I may never fully regain it. But I want to show that I'm willing to change. Not through words, but through actions." When he finished, a flurry of questions and shouts erupted from the press. Ethan remained calm as he left the room. He had done what he needed to, but the consequences still loomed over him like a heavy cloud. Later that evening, Ethan sat alone in the conference room of the hotel where the press conference had been held. The chairs around him were empty, and the sound of clicking cameras still echoed in his mind. He had told the truth. He had no choice. But now a deep uncertainty lingered. Had he done enough? Had he repaired anything, or was it already too late? His phone buzzed on the table. He picked it up and saw Olivia's name on the screen. His stomach tightened. Was she calling to support him? Or to tell him she wanted nothing more to do with him? With trembling fingers, he pressed the green button. "Hello?" he said, his voice softer than he'd intended. The silence on the other end felt like an eternity. Then he heard her voice, soft but resolute. "Ethan," she began, but what she was about to say hung in the air. The line between hope and despair had never been thinner. It had been a week since the press conference, and Ethan felt the world shifting around him. Though criticism in the media persisted and his reputation remained fragile, he experienced an unexpected sense of calm. For the first time in years, his focus wasn't on profit or power, but on building something larger than himself. His days were packed with meetings about the community center and the revival of Hughes & Co. The process was anything but easy. Permits were delayed, and former employees were skeptical of his intentions. Yet Ethan pressed on. Every small victory, a permit approval, a hesitant ex-employee agreeing to return, brought a sense of fulfillment he had never known before. At home, however, the atmosphere was different. Olivia remained distant, her words measured and her expressions unreadable. While she refrained from direct criticism, Ethan felt her trust was still fragile. He tried to give her space, but the uncertainty gnawed at him. Olivia sat alone at the kitchen table, staring at the untouched cup of tea in front of her. She thought about Ethan, about the speech she had watched, and the efforts he was making. She couldn't deny that he seemed sincere. Yet there was a wall of distrust she couldn't bring herself to tear down. She had quietly observed him working late into the night on his plans. She had seen him invite ex-employees of Hughes & Co. for meetings and even set up a mentorship program for aspiring entrepreneurs. It was more than she had ever expected. And yet, why couldn't she fully believe it? She hated that her doubts stood in the way. Maybe it was because Ethan had disappointed her before. Maybe it was easier to keep seeing him as the villain than to admit he might truly be capable of change. What if he's just doing this to save himself? She whispered to herself, her voice barely audible. It was a question she didn't dare ask. Not to him, not even to herself. That afternoon, Ethan stood in the community center, surrounded by boxes of supplies. Volunteers worked on painting the walls, and the building was finally taking shape. He had shared his vision, a place where entrepreneurs could thrive, where people could support one another, and where a community could flourish. "How does it feel?" asked a volunteer, a young woman who had just finished painting a section of the wall. Ethan looked around, taking a deep breath. "It feels real," he said after a moment of silence. "Honestly, I don't know if it's enough, but it feels good to build something that isn't about me." The volunteer smiled. "People can see that. Give it time." Ethan nodded, but her words didn't bring the relief he had hoped for. His thoughts drifted to Olivia, to her silent observations and unspoken questions. What would it take to show her that this wasn't just a facade? That evening, after most of the volunteers had gone home, Olivia found herself walking through the empty halls of the community center. She didn't know why she had come. Maybe to see if Ethan was truly as committed as he claimed. Maybe because she hoped for something that would quiet her doubts. Her footsteps echoed softly on the wooden floor as she approached Ethan's office. She heard voices and stopped by the door, which was slightly ajar. Ethan's voice was muffled but clear. "It was a tough decision," he said, "but sometimes you have to make sacrifices to do what's right." Olivia's heart skipped a beat. Who was he talking to, and what decision was he referring to? She couldn't make out the other voice, but its tone was formal. Her breath caught as old suspicions resurfaced. What if he was still playing one of his calculated games? What if everything he was doing was just another strategy? She wanted to push the door open, to confront him, but something held her back. What if she was wrong? What if he really was different? Her fingers trembled as she rested her hand on the door, but she couldn't bring herself to go further. For the first time, she didn't feel just anger or distrust, but something far more dangerous. Doubt in herself. Olivia sat at the kitchen table, the sprawling city stretching out behind the enormous glass windows. The view did nothing to calm her restless thoughts. Her fingers curled around a cup of tea as the words she'd overheard the previous night echoed in her mind. Ethan's voice had been calm, almost confident, as he spoke of making sacrifices. But what exactly did he mean? And why did it feel like he was hiding something from her? She glanced at her phone, lying just within reach on the table. Ethan's name was at the top of her recent call list. She wanted to call him, to confront him about what she'd heard, but something held her back. What if she misunderstood? What if confronting him was unfair? But what if she was right? "Why is it so hard to trust him?" she whispered to herself, her voice barely audible in the quiet room. It was a question that had haunted her for weeks. She could see he was trying to change. There was no denying that. But it was that very change that scared her. What if he was doing all this for his own benefit? What if she allowed herself to believe in him again, only to be disappointed once more? Meanwhile, Ethan was at the community center, sleeves rolled up as he moved chairs into a newly painted room. The space buzzed with the sounds of volunteers at work, brushes gliding over walls, the shuffling of supply boxes, and the low hum of friendly conversations. But Ethan's thoughts were elsewhere. That morning, he'd received a call from an investor who was skeptical about his plans for Hughes & Co. "Your intentions sound noble," the investor had said, "but let's be honest, Carter. No one's going to back a man with your history unless you can offer guarantees." The words had hit harder than Ethan expected. He knew his reputation was damaged and that rebuilding trust would take time. Still, it felt like he was fighting an uphill battle with no end in sight. How much more did he have to prove? "Everything okay, Ethan?" asked a volunteer, placing a box of paint cans on the floor. Ethan nodded, though his smile felt forced. "Yeah, all good. Thanks for your help." He returned to arranging the chairs, but the investor's words lingered in his mind. Could he ever fully earn Olivia's trust if even outsiders doubted his sincerity? That afternoon, while searching through a cabinet in the penthouse for old documents, Olivia's eyes landed on an envelope with Ethan's name on it. Pulling it out, she found a contract inside. Her fingers trembled slightly as she read through the text. The heading bore the name Hughes & Co., and the details outlined a clause suggesting Ethan had orchestrated a swift sale under questionable terms. Her heart sank. Why had he never told her about this? He had always described the takeover as just another business deal, nothing personal. But this document told a different story. It seemed he hadn't been entirely honest with her. With the contract in hand, Olivia left the penthouse and headed for the community center. Her thoughts were a storm of conflicting emotions. She wanted to believe Ethan was genuinely trying to change, but this document felt like proof that he was still hiding things from her. As Olivia stepped into the community center, she was immediately struck by the energy of the volunteers working to bring the building to life. Laughter and chatter filled the air, but her focus was solely on Ethan. She knew he was there. She could hear his voice as she approached his office. She stopped in the hallway, gripping the envelope tightly in her hands. Ethan's voice carried through the cracked door. "It was a tough decision," he said, "but sometimes you have to make sacrifices to do what's right." Olivia's breath caught in her throat. What decision? What sacrifices? Her mind raced as she tried to make sense of his words. Was this a remnant of the old Ethan, someone willing to do anything to achieve his goals? Or was this proof that he truly was trying to do the right thing? She wanted to push the door open to confront him with what she had overheard and what she had found. But she hesitated. What if she was misinterpreting everything? What if her constant questioning of his motives was unwarranted? But what if she was right? Her fingers trembled as she tightened her grip on the envelope. This moment could change everything, but in which direction she didn't know. Olivia stood in the doorway of Ethan's office, clutching the envelope with the contract tightly in her hand. Her heart pounded in her chest as she looked at him. Ethan sat behind his desk, his focus on a stack of documents. He looked tired, as though the past weeks had drained him. But Olivia couldn't feel sympathy, not now. "Ethan," she began, her voice rough with tension. He looked up, his eyes lighting up momentarily at the sight of her. "Olivia," he said softly, "what brings you here?" She stepped into the office and tossed the envelope onto his desk. "This," she said, her tone sharper than she intended. "Why didn't you ever show me this?" Ethan picked up the envelope, opened it, and pulled out the contract. His face hardened as he scanned its contents. Leaning back in his chair, he met her gaze, his expression unreadable. "I didn't think it was necessary," he said after a long pause. His voice was calm, but Olivia could hear the tension beneath it. "Not necessary?" she repeated, her voice rising. "Ethan, this proves you forced the sale of my family's business. How can you say it wasn't necessary to tell me? How am I supposed to trust you when you're still keeping things from me?" Ethan stood and walked around the desk, his hands slightly raised as though trying to calm her. "Olivia, listen," he began. "Yes, I made mistakes, a lot of them. I've done things I'm not proud of. But this wasn't about hurting you or your family. At the time, I thought it was just a business decision. Nothing more, nothing less." "A business decision?" Olivia's voice broke, her emotions spilling over. "This was my father's life, my family's pride, and you took it away as if it meant nothing. How can you expect me to ever believe you, Ethan? How do I know you won't just do the same thing again?" Ethan swallowed, her words cutting through him like knives. He knew he couldn't fix this with words, but he had to try. "I don't know," he admitted. "I don't know how to show you I'm different. But I know I'm trying, every day. Not just for you, but for myself. Because I can't be the man I used to be anymore." Olivia turned away from him, her back trembling with the weight of her emotions. "I want to believe you, Ethan," she said softly. "But every time I think you've changed, something comes up that reminds me of who you were." Ethan took a step closer but stopped short, afraid to overstep. "I understand," he said gently, "and I don't expect you to believe me right now. But please, give me a chance to prove it." Olivia stayed silent for a moment, her breathing slowly evening out. When she finally turned to face him, her eyes were filled with a mix of pain and hope. "I don't know if I can, Ethan," she said. "I don't know if I'm strong enough." The rest of the evening passed in silence. Olivia stayed at the community center for a while, watching Ethan as he continued to work on his plans. She wanted to leave, but part of her also wanted to see him fight, for himself, for her, for the vision he was trying to bring to life. When she eventually went home, she felt drained. Her emotions were a whirlwind, and she wasn't sure if she was ready to give Ethan another chance. Later that night, Ethan sat alone in his office, his head resting in his hands. He felt empty, as though his conversation with Olivia had drained all the energy from him. He knew she didn't fully believe him, and he couldn't blame her. But the thought that he might never be able to convince her gnawed at him. His phone buzzed on the desk. Picking it up, he saw an email notification from his lawyer. The subject line made his stomach drop. Urgent, new complaint against Carter Enterprises. With trembling fingers, Ethan opened the email. His eyes scanned the words, and a wave of despair washed over him. A rival business partner had filed a formal complaint about alleged fraudulent practices from Ethan's past. It was the last thing he needed, just as he thought he was making progress. Leaning back in his chair, Ethan stared at the ceiling. Just when he thought he was starting to get his life in order, everything seemed to be falling apart again. Ethan sat in the conference room of his lawyer's office, surrounded by stacks of files and a tense team working in near silence. The lawsuit against him threatened to undo all the progress he had made. While his lawyer outlined the details of the case, Ethan stared blankly at the table. It felt like being dragged back in time to the days when his power came from bending situations to his will. "We can fight this legally," said the lead attorney, peering at Ethan over his glasses. "But it's going to be tough. They have evidence suggesting you deliberately excluded competitors back then." "What do you recommend?" Ethan asked, his voice flat. "We could settle," the lawyer said. "Minimize the damage and keep it out of the media." Ethan closed his eyes, letting the words sink in. It was exactly the kind of solution he would have chosen in the past, silently pay off the issue and move on as if nothing had happened. But now it felt like a betrayal of everything he was trying to build. "No settlement," he said finally, his voice firm despite the tightness in his chest. "We tell the truth. No spins, no compromises." The lawyer raised an eyebrow. "Ethan, that could be disastrous for your reputation and your company." "Maybe," Ethan admitted, "but this isn't about my reputation anymore. It's about being someone I can look in the mirror and respect." At home, Olivia sat lost in thought, grappling with everything that had unfolded in recent days. Ethan's efforts to change were evident, but the new lawsuit had dragged her doubts back to the surface. What if he hadn't really changed? What if, despite his words, he was still the same man who had destroyed her family's business? She looked at a photo on her phone of the community center where volunteers worked together to create a space meant to help others thrive. Ethan was in the picture too, smiling as he talked to a young volunteer. It was hard to reconcile that man with the one who had crushed her father's dreams. Her gaze shifted to an envelope containing copies of old emails sent to her by a former employee of Ethan's. One email stood out. It was from a current employee at Ethan's company, addressed to the lawyers representing the opposing side in the lawsuit. The contents were damning. It appeared someone on Ethan's own team had leaked sensitive information to the plaintiffs. A chill ran down Olivia's spine. If this was true, who could Ethan trust? And more importantly, what would this mean for everything he was trying to achieve? That evening, Ethan stood in the community center, trying to focus on the work ahead. He stood by a freshly painted wall, admiring the handprints left by volunteers, a symbol of the collaboration and hope he wanted the space to represent. But the weight of the lawsuit hung heavy over him. It wasn't just his company at risk. If he failed, the community center and everything it stood for could crumble too. When Olivia walked into the building, Ethan noticed her immediately. Her face was tense, and she held a sheet of paper in her hand. His stomach twisted. This wasn't a casual visit. "I need to talk to you," she said, her voice clipped but controlled. Ethan nodded, bracing himself. "What's going on?" Olivia handed him the printout. "This came from a former employee of yours. It looks like someone on your team is involved in the lawsuit. Do you have any idea who this could be?" Ethan scanned the email, his eyes moving quickly over the text. The sender was one of his most trusted employees, someone he had mentored and helped rise within the company. He felt the ground shift beneath him. "I had no idea," he said softly, his voice filled with disbelief and anger. "I thought I finally had people around me who wanted the same things I did, change, progress. But this..." Olivia's gaze was as sharp as ever. "Ethan, if you don't get this under control, everything will fall apart. Not just your company, but the community center." Everything you've been working for." Ethan nodded, but instead of feeling defeated, he felt a surge of unexpected determination. "Then I'll fight," he said. "I'll prove who I am now, and I won't stop until I do." Olivia looked at him for a moment longer, as if trying to gauge his sincerity. Finally, she let out a sigh and turned away. "We'll see, Ethan. But if this goes wrong—" She trailed off, leaving the weight of her unfinished sentence hanging in the air as she walked away, leaving him alone with the email and the precarious balance of her trust. Ethan remained in the empty hallway of the community center, the email still clutched in his hand. His phone buzzed in his pocket. Pulling it out, he saw a message from his lawyer. "New developments in the lawsuit. Call me immediately." His throat tightened. No matter what he tried to do, it felt like his past refused to let him move forward. He looked back at the wall of handprints, a silent reminder of the hope he was trying to nurture. The question weighed on him. How much more would he have to sacrifice to prove that he had truly changed? Ethan stood in his office, the email from his lawyer still open on his phone. The words seemed to challenge him. "New developments in the lawsuit. Call me immediately." But Ethan knew what this meant. There were always new developments. It felt as though the past was determined never to release its grip on him. His gaze fell on the contract Olivia had found. The ink had long since faded, but the impact of that signature was still painfully fresh. This single document symbolized everything he had destroyed and everything he was now trying to rebuild. The following morning, Ethan sat in a conference room with his lawyer and the head of his legal team. But this time, someone else was present. The betrayer, the employee who had leaked information to the opposing side. Ethan locked eyes with the man, his stare cold and unyielding. "Why?" Ethan asked, his voice calm but laced with disappointment. The employee shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his hands fidgeting in his lap. I didn't think you'd find out," he stammered. "Honestly, it looked like you were going to lose anyway. It felt inevitable." Ethan felt anger boiling inside him, but he forced himself to remain composed. This man, someone he had trusted, had turned against him. Still, an outburst would accomplish nothing. "I've made mistakes," Ethan said after a long pause, his voice steady. "Big mistakes, but if there's one thing I've learned, it's that everyone has the chance to make things right. So I'll give you a choice. Work with us to undo the damage or leave for good." The man nodded slowly, his voice barely above a whisper. "I want to make it right," he said. "I want to prove I can change." Ethan leaned back in his chair, studying him carefully. He realized that this moment mirrored his own journey. But he wondered, was everyone capable of real change, or only those who truly wanted it? At home, Olivia sat alone. Without Ethan there, the silence was deafening. Her thoughts swirled with contradictions. She had seen him fight his past in recent weeks, seen glimpses of growth and vulnerability. But doubt still gnawed at her. Could someone truly change this much? She glanced at a message on her phone, an invitation to attend Ethan's upcoming trial as a witness. Her first instinct was to decline. It felt safer to keep her distance, to avoid risking further hurt. But another part of her, the part that had silently watched Ethan's efforts, whispered that he needed her. Not to save him, but to show him he wasn't alone. The courtroom buzzed with the murmur of journalists, lawyers, and curious onlookers. Ethan sat at the defense table, his posture stiff and his gaze fixed ahead as the prosecutor laid out their case. It felt as though the entire world was against him, but he had resolved to stop hiding. When the prosecutor finished, Ethan stood, ready to share his side of the story. But before he could speak, the doors to the courtroom creaked open. Olivia walked in. Ethan turned, his breath catching in his throat. Just seeing her there sent a wave of emotion crashing over him. Her steps were steady, her gaze unwavering as she made her way forward. She stopped and addressed the judge directly. "I'd like to say something," she said, her voice clear and firm. The room fell silent. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest. What was she about to do? Olivia took a deep breath. "I'm not here to defend Ethan Carter," she began. "I'm here to testify to who he is now, not who he was. I've seen his mistakes and I've lived with the consequences of them. But I've also seen him fight, to improve himself, to do the right thing, even when no one else is watching." The courtroom remained hushed, every pair of eyes locked on her. Ethan felt a surge of gratitude and disbelief. Despite everything, she had chosen to speak on his behalf. Olivia continued, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "The question isn't whether he's perfect," she said. "The question is whether he deserves the chance to make amends for his past." Her words hung in the air, resonating deeply. Ethan realized that her statement wasn't just for the judge, it was also for him. As Olivia stepped away, she turned and looked directly at Ethan. Her gaze was soft yet resolute, carrying both a challenge and a glimmer of hope. Ethan felt his throat tighten. Whatever the outcome of the trial, her words had given him something far more valuable, the belief that redemption was still within reach. The courtroom was eerily silent as the judge began reading her verdict. Ethan sat upright, his hands clasped tightly in his lap, his breath uneven. He had known this moment was coming, but that didn't make it any less nerve-wracking. "The court acknowledges that mistakes were made in the acquisition of Hughes & Co.," the judge said, her voice steady and impartial. "However, based on the available evidence, it cannot be concluded that these actions were deliberate or malicious. The charges are dismissed." A wave of murmurs rippled through the courtroom. Ethan felt a mix of relief and hollowness. He had won, but it didn't feel like a victory. He knew this verdict wasn't redemption, it was merely an opportunity to move forward. He glanced at Olivia, seated silently in the second row. Their eyes met, and for a moment he thought he saw a flicker of understanding. But her expression remained guarded, a delicate balance of empathy and skepticism. Ethan knew this outcome alone wouldn't be enough to regain her trust. That evening, Ethan sat on the couch in his penthouse. He had left the courthouse under the glare of flashing cameras and shouting journalists, but here the world was quiet. Olivia had come home with him, but they hadn't spoken yet. She finally broke the silence. "You won," she said, her voice measured as she watched him. "So they say," Ethan replied softly. He rubbed his hands over his face. "But it doesn't feel like it. There's still so much to make right." Olivia studied him, her expression softer than he had expected. "It's not about what they say, Ethan. It's about what you do now, how you choose to move forward." He turned to her, his eyes filled with genuine regret. "Olivia, I know I can't undo everything I've done, but I want to keep trying. Not to prove anything, but because I finally understand the damage I've caused." She was silent for a moment, as if weighing his words. "And what if I can't forget? What if I can't ever completely forgive?" Ethan nodded slowly. "Then I'll accept that. But I hope, for your own sake, you can see that we all make mistakes, and we all have the capacity to change." A week later, the reopening of the community center marked a new chapter for Ethan's journey. The space buzzed with life, filled with residents, volunteers, and entrepreneurs eager to start fresh. Ethan stood near the entrance, greeting people as they arrived. Olivia stood off to the side, observing him. She had never seen him look so comfortable, so free from the masks he had worn for years. When the ceremony began, Ethan stepped onto the small stage. He spoke about the power of second chances, not just for others, but for himself as well. "This building is more than a space," he said, his voice steady yet emotional. "It's a symbol of what's possible when we stop looking the other way. When we choose to fight, not for profit, but for what truly matters." The audience broke into applause, and as Ethan stepped off the stage, his eyes met Olivia's. She gave him a faint smile, one that wasn't a guarantee, but felt like a step forward. Later that evening, Ethan and Olivia walked through the now quiet community center. Most of the guests had left, and the silence felt almost sacred. Ethan stopped in front of the wall, adorned with the handprints of all the volunteers. His own handprint was there, right next to Olivia's. "Do you think this is enough?" he asked, placing his hand over his mark on the wall. Olivia stood beside him, silent for a moment before she replied, "I don't think anything can ever be enough, Ethan. But I think you're on the right path." Her words gave him hope, but also served as a reminder of how far he still had to go. He turned to her, his gaze searching. "And us? Do you think we could ever be enough?" She took a deep breath and looked him in the eye. "That depends on both of us, but I'm willing to try." Ethan felt a mixture of relief and trepidation. He knew their path would be filled with challenges, but for the first time in his life, he felt ready to face them, not just for her, but for himself. As they walked out together, Olivia glanced at him once more. "Maybe change is never perfect," she said, "but that doesn't mean it's not worth it." The doors of the community center closed softly behind them, and the sounds of the city enveloped them. Their silhouettes faded into the glow of the streetlights, ready to embark on a new chapter, however uncertain it might be. What do you think? Did Olivia make the right choice to keep trying? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more inspiring stories.